Hello, and welcome to the August 2023 edition of KRAD Readings. I'm Keith R.A. DeCandido, aka KRAD, and this is me coming to you every month with a new reading of one of my works of short fiction. This summer I had two short stories released. One I read last month, Know Thyself Deathless in the Double Trouble anthology. This month, as promised, here's the other one, a Sherlock Holmes story. A brand new story of the great detective, which is in the anthology Cases by Candlelight Volume 2. This is part of Christopher D. Abbott's long-running series of new Holmes stories called the Watson Chronicles, most of which are new novels by Chris, but he's also been doing anthologies, including the Cases by Candlelight anthology series, of which this is the second volume. The first volume featured stories by Chris, Aaron Rosenberg, and Michael Jan Friedman. The second volume includes those three gentlemen as well as me. My first time writing the canonical Sherlock Holmes, having already done two Shirley Holmes and Jack Watson stories for the Baker Street Irregulars anthologies, which I've read earlier in this YouTube channel. Anyway, before we get started, I just want to remind you all that you can find me all sorts of different places online. In particular, I urge you to check out my Patreon, which has monthly TV and movie reviews, vignettes featuring my original characters, excerpts from my works in progress, first looks at my first draft, and best of all, cat pictures! You just saw one cat meandering by a second ago there. Lots of pictures of Kaylee, Louie, and other cats that I have visited, as well as the occasional dog. And you should check that out. Patreon.com/KRAD. And you can find me online, all sorts of places. I'm still, amazingly, on Twitter, or whatever it's called these days. I might show up on some of the other social media things soon. I'm sort of trying to see how it shakes out. But I'm remaining on Facebook and Instagram, as well as my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com, so you should check those out. Anyway, this is The Thick Blue Line, a tale of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson by Keith R.A. DeCandido. Sherlock Holmes and I returned home from dinner to a sitting room full of policemen. We had gone to dinner at the Diogenes Club. I had hoped to go to Rule's, but alas, dining in public restaurants with my friend was no longer practical. Holmes's fame had grown to the point where, when we were amidst the general public, it was impossible to go more than a few minutes without an interruption from admirers who wished to pay their respects. Which was a pity, as the club's fare was inferior to that of the eatery in every respect. But since my own chronicles of Holmes's adventures have contributed in large part to that selfsame fame, I suppose I have no legitimate avenue for complaint. The club also required silence, which, in truth, I took as something of a relief. I had spent the day with a seemingly endless series of complaining patients, and was well and truly sick of conversation. For his part, Holmes was in one of his more contemplative moods, which generally meant long stretches of silence, occasionally punctuated by a brief outburst or perhaps violin playing. There would, however, be none of the latter whilst we were inside the club. I must admit to feeling a fraud every time I enter the Diogenes Club. As long as I'm with Holmes, those feelings are unnecessary. Holmes's older brother, Mycroft, is the club's founder, and that means that his immediate family is always welcome. As am I, presuming that I accompany a member of the Holmes clan. That last is important. Were I to attempt to gain ingress to the club alone, I would be turned away with all due dispatch. While Mycroft founded the club as a refuge for misanthropes and unsociable gentlemen, hence the requirement for silence in any spot in the club save the strangers' room, its membership rolls include some of the most influential men of the empire. Our meal, as expected, passed in companionable silence. After we completed dinner, we took a hansom cab back to Holmes's flat on Baker Street, only to find Mrs. Hudson looking very cross indeed. "There's a considerable assemblage of policemen in the sitting room, Mr. Holmes," she said. "In uniform or plain clothes, Mrs. Hudson?" my friend asked. "The latter. A half-dozen of them, if you please, and all quite familiar. I've made tea for all of them, and they've made themselves very much at home." I regarded Holmes with curiosity. For his part, my friend's visage was set in a most particular way. To the casual observer, he would appear to be emotionless, but I knew that stony look indicated that he was very much enmeshed in thought. "Come, Watson," he said after a moment. "Let us see what service we can perform for Scotland Yard." Then he practically bounded up the stairs to the sitting room. I followed him up at a more leisurely pace, and entered the sitting room to a sight I never expected to see outside of Scotland Yard itself. As Mrs. Hudson had indicated, there were 6 detective inspectors present in the sitting room. We had encountered all of them on cases in the past. Lestrade and Gregson sat on the settee, smoking cigars. Hopkins stood by the fireplace, a pipe clenched between his teeth, while MacDonald sat in an easy chair, the only one of the bunch still drinking the tea Mrs. Hudson had provided. Jones was by the bookcase, checking the spines of Holmes's library, while Bradstreet stood by the window. The remains of Mrs. Hudson's tea set was on the sideboard, the cups empty, the scones, jam, and clotted cream all a distant memory. "Gentlemen," Holmes said by way of both greeting and prompt. Bradstreet came away from the window. "Good evening, Holmes. Dr. Watson. We have come today to employ your services." Holmes moved toward the sideboard and removed a cigarette. "I assume, Inspector Bradstreet, that you wish me to secretly and unofficially investigate one of your colleagues or one of your superiors at Scotland Yard?" Jones looked away from his study of Holmes's books to stare daggers at him. "How could you possibly know that?" After lighting the cigarette and taking a puff, Holmes said, "Because if all 6 of you were assigned to a legitimate case, it would be one of great sensation and moment. Were I to be retained by Scotland Yard to consult on such a case, they would only send 1, possibly 2 of you to recruit me for that task, not all 6. And you certainly would not have the leisure to wait in my sitting room for the time it took you to consume virtually all of Mrs. Hudson's tea service, were there such a case. Therefore, it must be unofficial business, and there are few instances that would prompt all half-dozen of you to come to me, especially since at least 3 of you are decidedly uncomfortable with being present for this discussion." Even I could determine the latter, as Jones, Gregson, and Lestrade each gave the impression of ones who wished to be elsewhere. Holmes continued. "The only possible reason why you would all wish to retain my services is to investigate a fellow member of the constabulary. Were it anyone else, you would likely turn your own talents for investigation to the task at hand. But such undertakings against those of your own kind, as it were, is frowned upon, to say the least. That all of you are somewhat united in your desire to retain my services proves it." Bradstreet exchanged a glance with MacDonald, who said, "Aye, Holmes, you are, as usual, correct. We're wishing you to investigate the head of detectives, Superintendent Nash." Jones threw up his hands. "We don't want him investigating the super, just finding out why he's acting a total arse." Hopkins rolled his eyes. "And that is to be accomplished by investigating." Before the argument could escalate, Holmes asked, "What is it about Superintendent Nash that requires my—" His lips curled slightly, and he regarded Jones with amusement. "Finding out why he's acting a total arse?" Everyone looked at Gregson, who sighed. "A week ago, the super came in late, and he was obviously injured. After a great deal of unveiling on my part, he admitted that he was assaulted. I wished to open a case file, but he refused, saying it was merely a gang of youths who ran away upon realizing he was a copper. When I tried to insist, he did something he's not done in any of the 4 years he served in the post. He raised his voice." "And what did he proclaim at such an uncharacteristically high volume?" Holmes asked. "That I leave him be and not discuss it any longer." Lestrade then spoke. "That might have been the end of it, but Mr. Nash has been out of sorts ever since. He has become surly and discontent. With us, that is hardly an issue, but he was very short with the deputy commissionaire, and he missed a meeting with Lady Bromley, which her ladyship did not look kindly upon. Neither did Lord Bromley." Bradstreet retook the narrative. "Holmes, I've been with Scotland Yard for more than 30 years. I've seen many a superintendent come and go, and none are as fine a man as Archibald Nash. He looks out for us, and he knows his business. Most of the Johnnies appointed to the position are barely fit to put on a hat without assistance, much less run a squad of detectives. If he keeps on as he is, angering the nobility and the like, he'll be removed from his position and replaced by some dashed nincompoop, and then we'll all be in the soup." Holmes thoughtfully smoked his cigarette, dabbing out the ashes absent-mindedly on the floor. I sighed, making a mental note to warn Mrs. Hudson of the latest damage to the rug. "It is," he finally said, "not unusual for a man to suffer changes in personality after an assault." "We're well aware of that, Holmes," Lestrade said testily, "which is why we wish you to find the cause." Then Inspector Hopkins, who had long been an admirer of Holmes and his methods, said, We've taken up a collection to pay for your services, Mr. Holmes. That will not be necessary, friend Hopkins, Holmes said agreeably. I find the notion of determining an outcome that a full half-dozen of you were stymied by to be payment enough. Gregson took a puff of his cigar, and then said, We may at least provide you with an entree to speak to the super. I have finally, after a great deal of cajoling, I might add, convinced him that it is necessary for him to be examined by a physician. Ah! Holmes regarded me with pride. A task, surely, for the good Dr. Watson. I nodded. I'll be happy to examine him, of course. Bradstreet walked over to me and held out a card. As tomorrow is Saturday, Nash will be home. He'll be expecting you to call on him. I took the preferred item. Will he be expecting us both? I didn't wish to put a potential patient off by bringing unexpected company, even though my appointment was a pretense for putting Nash together with Holmes. That prompted a chuckle from Hopkins. Only a fool would expect one of the pair of you without the other, and the superintendent is no fool. Jones snorted. At least he wasn't until a week ago. Holmes finished his cigarette and actually put it out in an ashtray for a change. Rest assured, inspectors, that both Dr. Watson and myself will call upon Superintendent Nash immediately after breakfast tomorrow. Gregson, Lestrade, and MacDonald all got to their feet, the former two following Holmes's lead and stubbing out their cigars in another of Holmes's ashtrays. MacDonald approached Holmes and shook his hand vigorously. Thank you, Holmes. Even though you won't be accepting our payment, we remain in your debt. He then shook my hand and added, Our thanks, Doctor. Then he proceeded to the door. Jones, Gregson, and Lestrade simply shook hands with Holmes and myself, and followed MacDonald out. Hopkins at least favored us both with smiles. Bradstreet was the last, a frown under his thick beard. I hope this is nothing, merely a temporary spell he is enduring. If you believe that to be the case, Inspector, would you be here tonight? Holmes asked as he returned Bradstreet's handshake. The silence that followed that question was all the answer required. Bradstreet said, Doctor, as he shook my hand, and departed. Well, I said, once all men had quit the house. That was unprecedented. Most of those men don't even like you, Holmes. As always, Watson, it is a question of relative likes and dislikes. The distaste that many of those inspectors have for me is leavened by their great desire to not have Mr. Nash be replaced by an inferior model of superintendent. Indeed, I said. I retired to my own house, promising to return for breakfast and then accompany Holmes to Mr. Nash's home afterward. For his part, Holmes started toying with his test tubes, muttering about an experiment he hoped to finish. The next morning, we broke our fast with a lovely spread laid out by Mrs. Hudson, and then we took a hansom to Superintendent Nash's home on the outskirts of London, the address provided by the calling card Bradstreet had given me. A maid answered the door when we rang, and I offered my own card. She curtsied and led us to a sitting room. Minutes later, Archibald Nash entered through the side door. A tall, thin man with a shock of white hair and a moustache of the same color, he moved gingerly and very unsteadily sat down on a chaise lounge. He balanced himself with his right hand, but did so awkwardly, with the result that he fell more than sat in the chair. Excuse me. Greetings, Dr. Watson and Mr. Holmes. I see I was correct in assuming that, once Inspector Gregson had convinced me to see the good doctor here, that you would be attached leech-like to his side. I am here merely as moral support, Holmes said with much more politeness than I would have expected, or indeed than I felt, as that was rather a grave insult. But the man was also very obviously in pain, and my physician's oath overrode my natural tendency to defend my friend. Nash, however, was not content to accept Holmes's assurance. I sincerely doubt that, Mr. Holmes, he turned to me. Feel free to perform your examination, Doctor. I rose and said, It is already clear that you have ribs that are bruised, at the very least, possibly broken, and you seem to have taken some injury to your right hand. His left hand, in fact, Holmes said. I whirled around. Excuse me, Holmes? You assumed, Watson, that Mr. Nash's injury was to his right hand due to the difficulty he had in balancing himself on that hand when he sat down. However, Mr. Nash is left-handed, as evidenced by the ink stains on the outer part of his left palm beneath his little finger. He has also barely moved that arm since we arrived, despite it being his dominant one. Nash chuckled. He is correct, Doctor. My
My assailants did strike me on my left arm. It has made signing papers quite the challenge.
I dare say, Holmes said, that your position within Scotland Yard requires you to perform that action quite often.
It is a tiresome and vexing task, but a necessary one, Nash replied.
I hesitated before speaking. Sorry, Superintendent, but I must ask you to get to your feet once again. I held out my right hand to aid him in acceding to that request. He stared at the hand witheringly, and then his shoulders slumped in acceptance. Clasping my hand, he allowed me to pull him to his feet. The wincing that accompanied that motion proved me right about the damaged ribs. The way he virtually cradled his left arm proved Holmes correct as well. I continued my examination, even convincing the superintendent to remove his shirt, which he did with the utmost reluctance and only if Holmes would leave the room. Holmes was more than willing to acquiesce, and I suspected that he would take the opportunity to examine the rest of Mr. Nash's home. I determined the ribs were indeed bruised. The discoloration of the epidermis proved that, but I felt no break in any of them. There were similarly no breaks on the left arm, though I suspected that the musculature of same was strained and damaged. I also detected a bruise in the center of his stomach. I bandaged his ribs, which would help him heal, and I also recommended a sling for his left arm to keep it immobilized. Holmes returned just as Nash was buttoning his shirt. Finally, I told him, I recommend a course of morphine, injected twice daily.
Very well.
I take it, Holmes said as he entered, that Mr. Nash's examination is complete. Before I could reply, Nash did so.
Your powers of observation are as rudimentary as ever, Holmes. Please leave my home and continue your tiresome crusade to meddle in Scotland Yard's affairs to aggrandize yourself.
I seek no aggrandizement, Superintendent, Holmes said. It is the challenge that I pursue.
Challenge?
Nash asked in a derisive tone. Yes, the struggle to seek out the unknown where it bides in the shadows and bring it to the light through deduction and observation. But I have always left the credit, the colour, as your subordinates refer to it, to the inspectors of Scotland Yard.
And yet your friend the physician continues to publish his florid descriptions of your exploits in the Strand. Why do so if not for aggrandizement?
My dear Superintendent, I would be content if Watson never published a single story. I felt the need to defend myself. I, however, would not be content. Holmes has done great work in retarding the progress of crime in London and beyond. I seek not aggrandizement for my friend, Superintendent, but merely proper credit for a job well done.
You would be wise, Doctor,
Nash said in a slightly more conciliatory tone,
to limit yourself to medicine, to which I must say you are well suited. My chest feels better than it has in days, thank you. Good morning to you both.
That was a very clear dismissal, and there was truly little else I could accomplish on this day. I tarried only long enough to secure a follow-up visit for Friday next, and then Holmes and I exited with all due dispatch. Once we reached the street, Holmes hailed a hansom. He instructed the driver to take us back to Baker Street. That instruction was the last he spoke while we rode back, the silence of the ride far less companionable than that of our meal the previous evening in the Diogenes Club. But I knew this mood of my friend's. He was thinking. And it was best for me to bide my time until he was ready to speak. As it happened, that time came after we settled in the sitting room at 221B Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson having brought us a light luncheon. I dove straight into one of the small sandwiches, while Holmes grabbed only a single slice of bread.
What did you observe regarding the superintendent's injuries, Watson?
Between bites, I listed Nash's injuries and then provided my own conclusion. I can say in my professional opinion, Holmes, that he was not set upon by a group of youths. This was the work of a single man, one who knew how to injure with his fists in a manner that would not be permanent, no broken bones, for example, but which would be very painful. Oh, and which would not be visible. Every injury was to a part of the body that is generally covered, nothing on the face or hands, nor anything that would overmuch impede his ability to walk. Holmes nodded. And if Nash were right-handed, as most men are, the injuries would have little impact on his ability to continue going about his daily business. If his assailant did not know of his sinister nature, then it points to only one conclusion. And that is? That this was an attempt at intimidation. A warning, as it were. I dare say his assailant was a professional pugilist, though whether for sport or as a criminal enforcer, or both, is impossible to determine without more data. And from where shall we obtain this data? That is what I was searching the house in aid of.
There were clues throughout that I was able to observe while you were performing your medical ministrations.
I had a feeling that was the case.
What did you find? First, a query to confirm an assumption I made in my observations. Is Superintendent Nash a widower? He is, yes. He told me in the course of my examination that his wife, Anna, died of consumption some 15 years ago. As usual, my friend deduced on his own what I only knew from direct questioning. And indeed, that house has all the accoutrements of a single male dwelling within it. I recalled the maid who had answered the door. One of his household staff. None living in the house, according to the chambermaid. She and a cook both work for the superintendent, but go home to their husbands and children each night. I see, I said. And yet, despite Mr. Nash living the life of a bachelor this past decade and a half, there is evidence of a female presence in the house. That surprised me, since I had seen no such evidence. Though, to be fair, my examinations had been focused more on the man than the house. How so? I asked. To begin with, we have a locked room, which even the household staff is forbidden from entering. I winced, forced to put myself in a position to gainsay Holmes. I'm afraid there's a legitimate answer to that. Nash himself told me, while we were discussing his late wife, that the locked room upstairs was hers, and that he has kept it preserved as it was for these past 15 years. The same story was told to me by the chambermaid, but I detected the distinct odor of perfume wafting through the keyhole. Recently applied was this scent, and also one which I recognize as a variety that was introduced to the market only a year ago. I shook my head ruefully. I should have known better than to have even considered correcting Holmes, as he invariably turned it back on me like a boomerang. He continued, Furthermore, I spied a bit of fabric on the floor near the base of the door. Reaching into his pocket, he removed a small shard of cloth and handed it to me. Feels like silk. You're half right, Watson. It's a union fabric, a mixture of cotton and silk of a type that was pioneered centuries ago in the colonies, and which one particular dressmaker, Mr. KRAD, has brought to London for mass production in his shop. So, you believe that Nash is hiding a woman in his wife's erstwhile bedroom, and that she buys her clothes from this particular dressmaker? Well, the former, yes. But for the latter, I believe it is more accurate to say that the woman in question works at KRAD & Sons dressmakers. The swatch in question has been cut neatly by scissors by a professional hand. It is likely that it was a stray piece that accompanied her home from work, rather than, say, a torn piece. It was true, it didn't look torn. Shall we call upon this dressmaker? I asked. In due time. There is a change of shift at 4 o'clock, and I believe it would be most advantageous to approach at 4:15, enabling us to speak to our quarry without taking her away from her duties. How will you identify her? Holmes almost smiled. Observation, Watson, as always. Just then, Mrs. Hudson came in with a message from one of my patients who was having an emergency that required my immediate attention. I quickly swallowed the rest of my sandwich and gulped the remainder of my tea and took my leave of Holmes. My medical duties required my complete attention for the rest of the afternoon and evening, sadly, as an entire family had come down with maladies of the chest and throat. By the time I was finished with them, I was exhausted, and went home to collapse into a deep sleep. Bless her. My wife fixed a fine breakfast for me that was ready when I awakened. However, I was unable to savor it, as I was eager to learn of Holmes's progress in identifying Nash's mysterious woman. Excusing myself from my ever-tolerant spouse, after quickly devouring my morning meal, I hied myself to Baker Street to find that Holmes was also just arriving himself, dressed in one of his disguises. We retired to the sitting room together. I assisted him in the removal of the ginger whiskers, wig, and false teeth that combined with a rather shabby set of unwashed clothes to create the impression that Holmes was a beggar. As we restored him to his more natural state, Holmes regaled me with a tale of his discovery of the identity of the woman Nash had secreted away. My intention of identifying the woman in question was stymied by the sheer number of women who fit all the potential criteria. I was searching for a female who showed some signs of recent difficulty, who traveled home in the direction of the superintendent's house, and who showed an awareness of their surroundings one does not always expect from the fairer sex. Why that last? I queried, confused. Given the assault on Nash and the fact that she is kept in hiding even from Nash's domestic staff, I deemed it likely that she was in a certain amount of danger herself. I therefore proceeded on the assumption that my quarry would be one who was more aware of her surroundings than the average female. I nodded my understanding. My friend continued. Alas, I was parsimonious in my respect for the dressmakers of KRAD & Sons. Most of the women, particularly those of the lower economic classes, showed a high level of perspicacity. There were 4 women who fit all the criteria, both heightened awareness, a sense of fear, and who also walked in the direction of Nash's home to retire for the evening. Rather than leave it to chance and risk pursuing the wrong woman through the streets of London, I decided to pursue it from the opposite direction. Disguising myself in the manner in which you greeted me, I settled in a spot from which I had an unobstructed view of Nash's home at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning. I was forced to abandon that for a less salubrious view, albeit one that provided more distance from the superintendent's home, as I was in danger of being vanquished from my original post by a constable. No doubt the bobby was tasked with making sure that Mr. Nash remained unmolested by undesirables, such as what I appeared to be. No doubt, I said with a chuckle. However, I was able to spy the woman in question departing the premises, not an altogether simple task, as she left by the back door and worked her way to the streets via a most complex route. This, however, had the benefit of confirming my own hypothesis that the woman herself is also in danger, or perhaps the cause of the danger in which the superintendent finds himself. Did you then approach her? Holmes was now in the process of putting on a dressing gown, all the various items having been removed from his face and head, and his rather unfortunate articles of clothing deposited in the hamper. And not the wisest course of action given my state of dress, Watson. Now that I have a firm grasp of her identity, I will revert to the original plan of greeting her on her way out from work. Dressmakers are quite strict in their enforcement of working hours, and I do not wish to jeopardize the young woman's job. So she is a young woman, I said, at least in part to remind Holmes that he had not yet described her. Yes, she is in her 20s, and based on the state of her hands, she is relatively new to the dressmaking trade, as the expected calluses on her fingers have not yet completely formed. She walks with a slight limp, indicating some manner of injury to her left leg, likely to the ankle. In addition, her posture indicates an injury to a rib. Either that or a poorly tied corset, though given the circumstances, I think the former more likely. I did overhear conversations between several of the women working at the dressmaker, and the woman who I now know is living in Superintendent Nash's house goes by Clara. Since we would not be required to move forward with this particular inquiry until the late afternoon, and since Holmes required some actual sleep, though I suspected he would instead work on one of his experiments, I took my leave to spend more time with my neglected wife. Holmes and I agreed to meet at 4 o'clock. The meeting place was 2 blocks west of Craven & Sons, as we both agreed that the young woman would be more amenable to being approached by strangers to discuss her situation if she was not directly outside her place of employment. After a lovely day in the company of my beautiful wife, I hailed a hansom that brought me to the spot of our rendezvous. I arrived at 3:45. Holmes was, of course, already there. The only times he was ever not right on time for an appointment was when he arrived early. At precisely 4 o'clock, we could hear a distant whistle, which was no doubt far louder within the confines of Craven & Sons. 7 minutes after that, a young woman walked down the thoroughfare. Holmes approached her. "Forgive me, Miss Clara, but may I speak with you a moment, please? I am Sherlock Holmes." The woman started, then stared, her face hard and determined. "I'm sorry, I must..." Then she did what may only be described as a double-take. "My goodness!" She put her hand to her mouth, her expression now one of recognition and admiration. "You are he! Sherlock Holmes! I would not have recognized you had you not introduced yourself. I must say you only bear a passing resemblance to the illustrations that accompany Dr. Watson's stories in the Strand. Oh!" With that she turned to face me. "You must be Dr. Watson." I inclined my head. "At your service, Miss Clara. Though I believe," Holmes said, looking up and down her form, "that the prefix we are using is perhaps not accurate. Your left hand once held a wedding ring, did it not?" She straightened, and I noticed that her visage was now back to the hardened one she originally greeted us with. "May I ask what business that is of yours, Mr. Holmes?" "It is the business of Archibald Nash that I am concerned with. He has met with violence recently, as I believe you have as well. Given that Mr. Nash is hiding you in his home, I think it is reasonable to assume that the cause of the assault in question is at least related to yourself." For several seconds, Miss Clara simply stared at Holmes, regarding him with a curious mix of confusion, anger, admiration, and frustration. And then her face hardened further still. "You have not answered my question. What business is my life of yours, Mr. Holmes? Were you sent here by Mr. Northover?" I frowned in confusion. This was a new player in the case. Holmes did not miss a beat. "While I am not at liberty to divulge the name of my client, you may rest assured that it is not anyone named Northover, nor do I believe I have ever met any gentleman with that name." "I do not believe you, Mr. Holmes. And even if you are telling the truth, I have no reason to speak to you. I must respectfully ask that you cease to block my path. With only a moment's hesitation, Holmes stepped aside. Good day, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson, she said as she strode forward down the street. We returned to Baker Street in a hansom, and en route I queried Holmes as to our next move. I assume it is to identify this Northover? Indeed, Watson. Might he be involved with a bank of the same name? Holmes smiled at that. Well spotted, Watson. That shall be the starting point of our inquiries. Ah, and I see we even have the right gentleman to aid us. I followed Holmes's gaze out the hansom's window to see that Detective Inspector Gregson was standing in front of 221B Baker Street. Inspector, Holmes said upon disembarking from the cab, leaving me to pay the fare, it is fortuitous that you have arrived, as I have a query for you. And I have a complaint for you, Gregson said in a rather put-out tone of voice. I don't know what you and the doctor said to the super yesterday, but is in an even worse mood today than he was previously. His tone then softened, though I will say that he is physically much better, so thank you for that, Doctor. I bowed my head in acknowledgement. I'm afraid, Inspector, Holmes said, that the process of investigation is one that sometimes causes friction. Of course I'm aware of that, Gregson snapped. Then he took a breath to compose himself. I'm simply concerned that the issues that led to our commissioning your task are being exacerbated by your performance of that task. He has a meeting with the Deputy Commissioner first thing tomorrow morning, and we're all concerned that he'll say something untoward that will lead to his dismissal. One question that will aid in the task in question, Inspector. Has Superintendent Nash had any dealings with anyone named Northover? Gregson snorted. I should say so. His late wife, God rest her soul, was of the Northover clan. If I recall correctly, her great-uncle is Thomas Northover, the president of the Northover and Chadwick Bank on Lombard Street. Has he remained close to the family since his wife's passing? I have no idea. The super doesn't speak of personal matters. Another snort. If he did, we might not be in this mess. Gregson excused himself, and Holmes and I went upstairs to his flat. He then tasked the pair of us with going through his rather impressive backlog of newspapers, skimming copies of the Times in the hopes of discovering more about the Northover family into which Nash has married. After half an hour, I found a useful item. Look at this, Holmes, I said, handing him a paper from 1 year prior. Holmes perused the news item I indicated. Charles Northover is taking a leave of absence from his position as senior supervisor of the Northover and Chadwick Bank in order to spend more time in the country with his family. He reached for a paper of his own. Have a look at this, Watson. He handed me another paper from almost 2 years ago. Manley Chadwick has been installed as the new vice president of Northover and Chadwick, with Charles Northover resigning his position to spend some time in the Americas with his family. A fascinating pattern, wouldn't you say? And then there is this. He handed me another edition, turned to the marriage announcement, albeit from only 9 months ago. I perused it with curiosity. Charles B. Northover, the floor manager of Northover and Chadwick Bank, is to be married to Emelina C. Richmond. Curious, Holmes said, that on at least 2 occasions Northover was departing his employment from the bank in order to be with his family, which generally refers to one's wife and children in such a context. But he was not yet married. He practically leapt to his feet. Come, Watson! Mr. Nash should have returned home from his daily toils at Scotland Yard. I was dubious as to whether or not Nash would welcome us, given that we had exposed his harboring of Miss Clara, but said nothing as we went outside to hail a hansom. To my surprise, when the maid answered Nash's door, she said, Mr. Nash is expecting the pair of you. Please come through. She led us to the dining room this time, where Nash was seated at the head of a wooden table that sat 6, a tea set laid out in front of him, with cups and saucers in front of the 2 chairs on either side of him. Upon our entrance, Nash said, Have a seat, gentlemen. It seems we have much to discuss. Thank you, Matilda, that will be all. The maid curtsied and quit the dining room. Holmes and I exchanged a quick glance, and then each took a seat. Since the chambermaid had been dismissed, I took it upon myself to pour tea for myself and Holmes. As I did so, Nash said, It seems you have learned my secret, Holmes. Holmes inclined his head toward me in acknowledgement of the tea I poured, then regarded Nash. I have learned the facts, Superintendent, the how, as it were. What I am unclear on is the why. It is for our protection that I have kept the girl ensconced in my wife's former room. Nodding, Holmes said, Yes, that would follow. I was confused. Follow from what? Before my friend could reply, Nash said, I'm more interested in your own why, Holmes. What business is this of yours? You usually only stick your nose in others' affairs at the behest of some client or other. Miss Clara assumed that you were working for the Northovers. Is that the case? And... He leaned forward slightly, giving Holmes a look that might have been menacing were Holmes made of lesser stuff. Do not prevaricate with me, Holmes. I care not for whatever tired ethics you might wish to toy with. A girl's life is at stake. I added, and your safety, I would think. Nash waved me off. Immaterial. I can look after myself. There is evidence against that notion, Superintendent, Holmes said with a slight smile. Let me assure you first, as I did Miss Clara, that I am not working on behalf of the Northovers, nor anyone else from Northover and Chadwick. I had no inkling of any involvement of the Northovers in this case until Miss Clara herself mentioned it when we accosted her. No, in this instance I have been retained by your detective inspectors at Scotland Yard. That took Nash visibly aback. I beg your pardon? A half-dozen of them all gathered in my sitting room to plead with me to find out... He turned to look at me. How was it that Inspector Jones phrased it, Watson? I smiled. To find out why the superintendent is acting a total ass. A scoff from Nash was the initial reply. That certainly sounds like Jones. And he was joined, Holmes said, by Lestrade, Gregson, Bradstreet, Hopkins, and MacDonald, all impressively united in their desire to have me determine what happened to you, and how it might be fixed in a manner that would allow you to keep your job. Your subordinates, it seems, think highly of you as their supervisor, and do not wish you to be removed from your position due to your ill temper. Nash had softened considerably upon hearing this intelligence. Good men, then. Good men. I should have known better than to think that Gregson would let it go when I told him to. The superintendent took a sip of his tea, finishing it off, then poured himself another cup. Very well, Holmes. Now that I'm satisfied that my wife's family didn't send you, I will take you into my confidence. Allow me to save you some trouble, Holmes said. Miss Clara is more properly referred to as Mrs. Northover, and she is married to Mr. Charles Northover, who has been, at various times, Vice President, Senior Supervisor, and Floor Manager of Northover and Chadwick. For a moment I was perplexed, as the woman Charles Northover was listed as being wedded to was named Emelina, but then I recalled that her middle initial was C, which I now realized likely stood for Clara. Holmes continued. Mr. Northover is short of temper and has caused a scene in the bank his family owns more than once. He has been relieved of responsibilities each time under the guise of taking time away in order to avoid scandal. 9 months ago, he was married to Emelina Clara Richmond, no doubt the latest attempt to civilize him. Nash shook his head. You say you only know of Charles Northover's relationship to Clara, or, as you say, Emelina, though she has always preferred to be called by her middle name. Yet you are remarkably well informed. Simply a matter of deduction based on the available evidence, in this case found in various issues of the Times that chronicle the comings and goings of bank employees in their financial section, as well as the marriage announcements. Well, your deductions are correct, Holmes. Clara was affianced to Charles Northover in an attempt to make a proper gentleman of him. Alas, I fear he does not contain the material for such a manufacture. His temper is quite short, and he is a large man who is skilled in the pugilistic arts. He boxed for Cambridge in his university days. May I assume, I said gently, that it was he who inflicted the injuries to your person rather than a gang of children? Nash hesitated before speaking. Yes, Doctor, and your deduction, Holmes, that he behaved poorly in public at the bank on more than one occasion is correct. The Northovers do insist on giving him more chances, however, and they also hope that having a wife would aid in his succeeding at the latest of those chances as floor manager of the bank. I take it by your harboring the wife in question that it failed? Holmes asked. Now Nash spoke in a most bitter tone. All being married to Clara accomplished was to give Northover a different target for his ire. Rather than range from uncivil to physically dangerous to bank clientele, he instead was uncivil and physically dangerous to his wife. He attacked her on a regular basis. How aggressive the violence would vary according to the tenor of his daily work. The worst was after he lost an important client and was blamed by his father. That was when he broke her arm. I sipped my tea to cover a snarl of annoyance. While I knew that there were some who felt that a husband had the right to do to his wife as he wished, there was, to my mind, no call for assaulting one's spouse. Clara came to me when she learned that I was part of the family. She had hoped that I would be able to help her in my capacity as a policeman. Nash's face darkened. Unfortunately, my hands are tied. There is no legal redress for prosecuting a man for inflicting harm upon his wife. Her Majesty views the marriage bed as sacrosanct. Holmes sipped his tea. I see. Since you were unable to assist her through your job, you instead granted her a sanctuary in your house. It was the only recourse left to me. Hardly that, Superintendent, Holmes said. You could have returned her to her husband. Pointing an accusatory finger at Holmes, Nash said, Never! Do you hear me, Holmes? Never! I watched my father beat my mother unto death, and I'll be damned if I allow such a thing to happen again if it's within my power to prevent it. Bowing his head, Holmes said, Thank you for making clear your own motives, Superintendent. I take it that Mr. Northover learned of your hiding his wife from him, or at least suspected? The latter. He accosted me on the street and accused me of kidnapping Clara. I told him nothing, of course, and he responded to my silence with his fists. I could not help but ask the next question. Why did you not arrest him? To what end, Doctor? Do you imagine that Clara and I were his only victims? Holmes nodded sagely. The times he was on leave from the bank, those were due to assaults. In some instances, on persons of higher standing than I. Any attempt to arrest him would be met with a reprimand from my superiors, an apology to the Northovers, and likely cost me my job. Northover has a short temper, and he is quick to lose it, but there is naught that can be done. He is not the only one so afflicted, Holmes said quietly. I beg your pardon? Your own short-tempered outbursts are what prompted a half-dozen of your subordinates to seek out my services. However, that will, I believe, be a net gain. It is obvious that the next course of action will be to contrive to remove Northover permanently. Nash's eyes widened. Please tell me, Holmes, that you're not so depraved as to have the man assassinated. Hardly, Holmes said dryly. I would never dream of involving you in such a scheme, Superintendent. I couldn't help but notice that Holmes didn't deny the possibility of such a scheme were a Superintendent of Scotland Yard not involved, but thought it politic not to say as much. Holmes continued. It is simply a matter of taking advantage of the frustration from which his family is obviously suffering due to his continued inability to manage his outbursts of violence. And by what means did you deduce that? Nash asked rather curtly. Each time he returned to work at the bank, he was in a lesser position. That indicates growing impatience on the part of the elder Northovers, as they are unwilling to simply restore him to his previous position. For all that they are avoiding legal consequences to his actions, he is being punished. His latest position is that of floor manager, which is hardly a worthy occupation for someone of his breeding. So what do you propose? Nash asked. First, I'm afraid I must question Mrs. Northover about her husband. Superintendent, might you contrive to have her to have an audience... Excuse me. Superintendent, might you convince her to have an audience with Dr. Watson and myself? Nash stroked his mustache. I will ask her if she wishes to speak to you, Holmes, but I will abide by whatever answer she gives. She was forced into this marriage by her parents. The Richmonds have lost their standing over the last few decades and were in desperate need of the status accorded by being married into the Northover family. Nash shook his head ruefully. Indeed, my own motives for choosing to marry dear Anna were similar. In any event, if Clara refuses to speak to you... Holmes held up a hand. I understand. I, too, shall abide by her wishes, whatever they might be. Nash excused himself. For a few moments, Holmes and I sat in a companionable silence that reminded me of the Diogenes Club. I broke that quiet with a question. What if Miss Clara, that is, Mrs. Northover, refuses to speak to you? Her contributions will merely make the plan more efficacious, but I believe that even if she does not contribute, we should be able to effect a resolution that will satisfy all parties. He then smiled slightly. Well, all that is, save for Northover himself. Hardly one for whom we wish satisfaction, I said wryly. Indeed. Matilda, the chambermaid, entered the dining room with a fresh pot of tea, removing the nearly empty one on the table. Just as Matilda departed with the used teapot, Nash returned, with his charge trailing behind. Miss Clara, thinking about it, I preferred that nomenclature to Mrs. Northover for all that the latter was more proper, looked less formal than she had when last we met. Her curly brown hair was drowned down about her shoulders, and she wore a simple house dress. Not the usual manner in which a lady of the house greeted formal guests, even in these liberal times, but in this case I was simply grateful she agreed to see us at all. We three stood in the presence of a lady, as was proper, regardless of her mode of dress. Miss Clara asked Holmes, "You wish to question me about my husband?" "Yes, madam, I do." She took a seat at the foot of the table, opposite where Nash had sat. Nash himself retook his place at the head and poured some tea for Clara. Holmes and I sat back down as well. "Mr. Nash tells me that you were not sent by my husband, nor by any of my in-laws." "Indeed not, madam. In fact, your involvement in the case was not known to me until shortly before we met outside your place of employment. I was commissioned by Mr. Nash's subordinates at Scotland Yard, as they wished to know the reason for his sudden ill temper." At that, Miss Clara shot her benefactor a shocked look. "Ill temper?" Nash waved her off. "A trifling. The detective inspectors under me were worried about nothing." It was obvious to me that Nash didn't wish to concern Miss Clara about his own difficulties. Holmes either did not make that inference, or, more likely, he didn't care, preferring to speak the truth, no matter how brutal or painful. "If I recall correctly," Holmes said with sardonic modesty, "they feared for your continued employment, particularly after you angered Lord and Lady Bromley." Now Miss Clara glowered at the superintendent. "Why didn't you tell me?" "As I said, it was a trifling," Nash said dismissively. "Bad enough that Charles assaulted you, but now your job is at risk. I cannot continue to allow this." Now Nash's tone was harsher. "You will not go back to him. I won't allow it." Before Miss Clara could reply, Holmes said, "In this, madam, the superintendent and I are in agreement. Returning to your marriage bed is not an option, given your husband's tendencies. I have a plan I wish to set in motion to remove him from your life, but it does require some interrogation on my part of your husband's moods and mores." Miss Clara continued to stare with apprehension at Nash for a few seconds, then regarded Holmes with an expression that seemed to have a glimmer of hope. I suspect that it was the first time her visage had displayed such in some time. "If it will aid you in ridding me of my husband, Mr. Holmes, I will answer any question you ask on any subject." Nodding, Mr. Holmes said, "Just so. First of all, can you give me a notion of what subjects tend to provoke Mr. Northover's ire, particularly the more violent outbursts?" At that, Miss Clara scoffed. "It would be a shorter list, Mr. Holmes, if you asked me what doesn't provoke his ire. He dislikes any discussion of matters financial. Some of his most brutal outbursts were when I questioned him about money." I couldn't help but comment, "He works in a bank?" "He does, Dr. Watson, and he hates his job with a fiery passion. Reminders of it only serve to anger him. As does any discussion of politics, as he finds Her Majesty to be, in his words, a foolish woman with all the sense the Almighty granted a snail, and all of Parliament to be made up entirely of, again in his own words, damn fools and mendicants." These words outraged me greatly. In the company of Holmes, I had had the singular privilege of meeting Queen Victoria, and even if I hadn't, to hear such slander against her rankled, to say the least. I find it appalling that any Englishman would refer to Her Royal Majesty in such outrageous terms. With a twinkle in his eye, Holmes added, "However, his description of Parliament is quite apt." "He will also grow surly at the mere mention of cricket, as he views it as not being a true sport for athletes, but rather for," and again, these are his words, "effete bourgeois children who wish to play at being athletic." Holmes had steepled his fingers near his face, and was staring intently at Miss Clara. "What subjects enrage him the most? Ones that provoke particularly strong responses?" Now Miss Clara shifted uneasily in the dining room chair. I could see that this made her uncomfortable, as the strong responses Holmes was asking about generally involved the collision of Northover's fist with her corpus. However, she did eventually reply. "Any criticism of his appearance would result in a very violent response." "Do you speak of his grooming, his manner of dress, or the arrangement of his facial features?" Now her lips twisted into a bitter smile. "All of the above, Mr. Holmes. Worse, he would often ask after his appearance. Is his tie straight? Is his hair well combed? Is this suit jacket appropriate for the occasion? Any answer other than the affirmative would be met with opprobrium." "There is no need for euphemism, madam," Holmes said. "My apologies, Mr. Holmes, but it is..." She hesitated. "Difficult to speak of this." "I do understand," he said gently. "Just one more question, and then the interrogation will be complete. What is your husband's drink of choice on social occasions?" "He prefers an American drink, a type of whiskey that they produce over there called bourbon. I know very little about it. He discovered it on a trip to the United States during one of the times his family sent him away. But he enjoys it, rather. Excellent. Holmes favored her with a nod. I believe I have sufficient intelligence to enact my plan with a far greater chance of success than I would have without this interview. So I do thank you, ma'am. She got to her feet. In that case, I would like to return to my room, please. We all rose as well. Nash said, Of course, Clara. After she departed, Nash sat back down. I was about to, but Holmes didn't, so I refrained. I thank you for your honesty, Superintendent, Holmes said. Armed as I am with the information provided by you and your charge, I must now go forth and enact the plan of which I spoke. Why do I have the feeling that, as an officer of the law, it is better if I do not know the details? I can assure you, Superintendent, that I have no intention of breaking the law. Good evening. We took our leave, and when we arrived on the street, Holmes said, It is late, and there is little I might do to set my plan in motion this evening. I will begin preparations tomorrow. May I be of assistance? Not in the preparation. However, your presence at the execution of the scheme will be greatly desired. I am not yet sure of the exact time, but when I have that, I will provide you with that and the place as well. We took a hansom back to Baker Street. I had left my bag at Holmes's flat, so I had the cabbie wait for me, and after saying my goodnights to Holmes and to Mrs. Hudson, I re-entered the cab and took it home. After a pleasant night at home with my wife, followed by a hearty breakfast, I saw a few patients over the course of the next day. In late afternoon, one of his irregulars came by with a note from Holmes, saying to meet him in the strangers' room at the Diogenes Club at 7 p.m. That rather surprised me, as Holmes had never invited me to the Diogenes Club as such. We had gone in together on several occasions, but I had never been so bold as to approach the entrance of the club on my own. It was, therefore, with a great sense of apprehension that I hied myself to the club that evening. However, I was fortunate in that there was a steward, whom I did not recognize from any of my prior visits, outside the entrance. An elderly, bold gentleman in an impeccably tailored suit, with a huge beak nose, he regarded me with barely concealed disdain and asked, Are you Dr. Watson, or Mr. Northover? The former, I said emphatically, not wishing to be mistaken for that gentleman under any circumstances. Follow me, please, he said, moving toward the door. Until we reach the stranger's room, please observe silence at all times. Any breach of this rule will result in your immediate expulsion from the club, and also a sanctioning of your sponsor. I somehow doubted that a sanctioning of the brother of the club's founder would be all that effective, but I only said in reply, of course. The steward sniffed his disapproval and then opened the door. We walked through the club's corridors, the only sound being the footfalls of those who were ambulatory, myself, the steward, and a gentleman who was headed toward the water closet, until we reached the stranger's room. The steward opened the door, and I saw Holmes inside, seated in an easy chair, smoking his pipe and reading today's Times. There was another easy chair next to it, and facing it was a divan. All three seats were in a semicircle, facing a small table, on which sat a bottle of amber liquid and 3 thick-bottomed glasses. Holmes looked up from the paper and nodded in my direction, waiting until the steward closed the large wooden door behind me, thus reducing the possibility of the noise carrying beyond this room, before saying, Welcome, Watson! I must say, Holmes, I said as I took a seat in the other easy chair, I was surprised to find you inviting me here. All will be clear in due course, Watson, which is what Holmes always said, and to be fair, it almost always was. Now that I was seated, I could see the label on the bottle, which identified it as a Kentucky bourbon, the very drink that Miss Clara had identified as being her husband's favorite. Somehow I could not bring myself to be surprised that the Diogenes Club could supply the imported libation at a moment's notice. 2 older gentlemen walked in unaccompanied, nodded to Holmes, and took a seat on the couch on the far end of the room. One was a ginger in both hair and beard, with flecks of gray throughout, who had his own copy of the Times, while the other, who was bald of both head and face, had a leather-bound book. Each commenced to reading as soon as they sat down, and both remained as quiet as if they had been elsewhere in the club. A minute or two later, the large door creaked open again, and this time the steward was leading a broad-shouldered gentleman in a suit that was obviously tailored, yet also was bizarrely ill-fitting. It was unclear how he managed to make a tailored suit look so terrible, but manage it he did. He had a thick mustache in, ironically, the same style as Nash. His was dark brown, as was his short, slightly wavy hair. Not waiting for the steward to shut the door, he said in a booming voice, "Ah, so you're the famous Holmes!" We both got to our feet. As I rose, I noted the disapproving look of the steward as he closed the door behind him. "I am indeed Sherlock Holmes," he said, offering his hand. "And you must be Mr. Charles Northover." Northover returned the handshake. "Quite!" Indicating me after breaking the grip, Holmes added, "And this is Dr. John Watson." He offered his hand to me. I didn't particularly wish to shake the man's hand under any circumstances, but as I assumed that being rude upon greeting was not part of Holmes's plan, I nodded my head and returned it. Northover then looked around the room. "Don't know why you wanted to meet in this dashed place. Like the ill-considered love child of a pub and a mausoleum." "My apologies," Holmes said, "but I wish this conversation to be in private. Besides, I knew that I could provide a libation that you would find to your liking." Holmes indicated the table, and only then did Northover register its contents. His face brightened noticeably. "Ah, good show, Holmes, good show!" Indicating the couch, Holmes said, "Please, have a seat, Mr. Northover, that we may discuss our business. Watson, if you'd be so kind." I nodded and pulled the cork from the bourbon bottle, proceeding to pour a dram for each of us. "Can't imagine what business that would be," Northover said as he clumsily collapsed onto the couch. "But I'll certainly take the drink." I distributed the drinks to my compatriots, then took the last for myself. "Your health," Holmes said, holding up the glass. "I'll drink to that," Northover said, and followed words with action. I did the same. I found the drink to be rather brash and aggressive. Quite American indeed. While Holmes and I sipped, Northover took what could better be classified as a gulp, then set the glass down on the table with a hearty thud. "I dare say, Doctor, that such a thought would put you out of business, eh? Good health and all that?" "Nothing would make me happier than to not be necessary, Mr. Northover," I said. Northover grunted and then turned to my friend. "So, what's this business of yours, Holmes?" "I wish to speak of your employment at the bank." Now Northover's face soured. "Oh, dash it, man, must we? Now, if you wish to discuss bank business, pay a call upon me during business hours, when I'm working at that wretched place. We're in a club with fine drinks. We should be speaking as men, not as bankers." "You find that there's a difference between the two?" "Oh, don't get me wrong, it pays the bills and all that, but this is hardly the place for it." "I ask only because you seem to be on a downward path." Sitting up straight, Northover said, "I beg your pardon?" "You have gone from vice president all the way down to floor manager," Holmes said, his matter-of-fact tone a contrast to Northover's increasing bellicosity. "You'll be working as a clerk next." "Dash it, man, it's just keeping harmony betwixt family and business, don't you know? I took a couple of sabbaticals, and it would be damned awkward if I returned and took the position away from the poor sod who replaced me, now wouldn't it? No, the old man preferred to bung me into whatever position was available when I returned to work." "I see. So it's not your appalling manners, your unfortunate state of dress, or your pugilistic tendencies that led to repeated demotions?" Now Northover stood up, pointing an accusatory finger at Holmes. "Now look here, Holmes! I'll not sit here and be insulted." "I would be quite willing to continue to insult you as you stand, Mr. Northover." Moving at impressive speed for a man so large, Northover reached out, grabbed Holmes by the lapels, and hauled him to his feet before I could even react. His face twisted into a rictus of fury. Northover's fists flew at Holmes. To his credit, Holmes protected his face and chest with his arms and hands, his limbs taking all the damage and sparing his vital organs from the pummeling. However, he did not strike back, allowing Northover to continue assaulting him. I tried to move to help my friend, but I succeeded only in getting an elbow to the stomach. I stumbled backward, falling into the easy chair, struggling to catch my breath from the impact to my solar plexus. The two older men got up from the couch. The ginger said, "Hey now, there'll be none of that." They both approached the Malay, with the bald one saying, "Sir, this is the Diogenes Club. We do not allow roughly—" His words were cut off by Northover backhanding him in the face, forcing him to fall backward into his ginger friend. What composure I'd regained was then lost at this appalling treatment of an elderly gentleman. Holmes, at least, had provoked him, so one could perhaps rationalize his behavior, but nothing justified what he'd done to the bald man. Holmes apparently felt the same, as only then did he fight back, using his own training in matters pugilistic. The battle became much more even-handed after that, as both gentlemen rained blows upon each other. I moved to Northover's other victim, who was being cared for by the ginger fellow. "I'm a doctor," I said. At that, the ginger moved aside, and allowed me to examine his companion. I held up 3 fingers. "Sir, I'm Dr. Watson. How many fingers do you see?" "5, but only 3 are upright." I chuckled. "And the date?" He provided today's date. No sign of delirium. "I'm afraid your left eye will darken and likely swell shut before long, but you should be all right otherwise." "Physically, perhaps," the bald man muttered as the ginger and I both helped him to his feet. The ginger winced, and I said, "I should take a look at that shoulder." "It's fine," he said dismissively. I let it go for now, as we had more pressing matters to deal with. The big doors creaked open, and several of the club's stewards entered. By this point, Holmes had Northover in an impressive arm lock that immobilized the banker. For his part, Northover was now screaming, "I'll kill you, you bloody bastard!" "Summon the police," Holmes said to one of the stewards, who nodded and exited. Northover was still screaming, "Do you know who I am? I'm a bloody Northover!" The bald man stepped forward. "Do you know who I am, Mr. Bloody Northover? Besides some damned fool who got in the way of a perfectly good spat?" Holmes said, "May I present Sir Alfred Cuthbert, Assistant Commissioner of the Foreign Office. Oh, and his cousin, Mervyn George Lord Halbersham, Earl of Howe and Chief Whip of the House of Lords." Only then did Northover's face start to register the magnitude of what he'd done. Assaulting even so famous a personage as Sherlock Holmes would hardly matter to someone belonging to a family of the Northover's status, but a high-ranking official of the Foreign Office and a high-ranking peer? Even in these more democratic times, neither the House of Lords nor Whitehall were to be trifled with. A steward returned with 2 constables, who took Northover away. To my own relief, Northover did not struggle, displaying a sense of self-preservation with which I would heretofore not have credited him. Lord Halbersham then approached Holmes with fury in his eyes. "Mr. Holmes, be advised that it is only in deference to your brother that we do not have you arrested alongside that ruffian you invited. Consider your familial privilege that allows you to ingress into the club to be under review until further notice. You and the doctor must depart at once!" Holmes inclined his head, and we both departed with all due dispatch. As we rode back to Baker Street in a hansom, I said, "I have a statement and a question, if I may, Holmes." "Of course, Watson." "The former is this. You will allow me to examine you when we arrive at the flat. Your opponent landed quite a few blows, and I fear for the state of your arms." "Naturally. And your question?" "How did you convince a peer and a government official to sit in the stranger's room with us?" "I didn't. Mycroft did. I approached my brother and asked him if there were 2 or 3 gentlemen who were of impeccable antecedents and sufficiently exalted status that even the Northover name and bankroll could not cover up a crime against them, and whom Mycroft would not object overmuch if they were, perhaps, assaulted a bit." And what was his response? His lips showed the remotest possibility of considering the likelihood of potentially curling upward into the semblance of a smile, and he said he had just the chaps. I chuckled. For Mycroft Holmes, that was the equivalent of a belly laugh. I idly wondered what precisely it was that Lord Halbersham and Sir Alfred had done to annoy the elder Holmes. Holmes added, "I also sent a telegram to Superintendent Nash advising him to stay late at the office today, as there would be a matter that would require his personal attention somewhere around the hour of 8 in the evening." The following day, I had a patient to call upon who happened to be proximate to Baker Street, so after my house call, I walked into 221B to find that Inspectors Bradstreet and Lestrade were already present in the sitting room. "Ah, Watson, come join us. The inspectors were just informing me of the conclusion of the Northover affair." "Well, the Nash affair, as far as we're concerned," Bradstreet said. "The super's back to his old self as of this morning. He himself supervised the arrest of one Charles Northover last evening, before officially handing the case over to Gregson, and received approbation this morning from Lord Halbersham and several high-ranking members of the Foreign Office." Lestrade added, "The Deputy Commissioner was looking at him with respect and admiration and inviting him to luncheon just before we left to fill you in. Oh, and Gregson mentioned that the super specifically asked him to make sure that the arrested man's wife was cared for by the man's family, and he made a similar request to Lord Halbersham." Bradstreet reached out his hand and said, "Oh, thanks, Holmes. We've got our man back, and we couldn't be happier." I added, I dare say Mrs. Northover is happier too. Holmes said, perhaps. She'll be able to ask for a divorce, but the best she'll be able to obtain from Parliament is mensa et thoro, divorce due to extreme cruelty. With Lord Halbersham as a victim of that self-same cruelty, that is the most likely outcome. Bradstreet frowned. That means she'll not be able to remarry. I somehow doubt that the lady in question will find that too onerous a condition, Holmes said dryly. I nodded in agreement. Perhaps she would be forced into the life of a spinster, but I was fairly certain that Mrs. Northover, that Miss Clara, would prefer that, with her erstwhile husband in prison, to still being married to that brute. At least she is still alive and safe, thanks to the good work of my friend, Sherlock Holmes. The end. Cases by Candlelight Volume 2 is available from Amazon.com in trade paperback, hardcover, or ebook. Again, it is part of a whole series called The Watson Chronicles, which includes novels by Christopher D. Abbott, and 2 so far editions of Cases by Candlelight, which are anthologies that include stories by Christopher, by Aaron Rosenberg, by Michael Jan Friedman, and in this one by myself. There will be a 3rd Cases by Candlelight next year, as well as another anthology that's going to do alternate versions of Sherlock Holmes. I'm going to be in both of those. I'm going to be doing a new Holmes and Watson story for the Cases by Candlelight Volume 3. I will also be doing a Shirley Holmes and Jack Watson story for the other anthology. That will be called A Scandal on 47th Street. And I'm going to be doing another Shirley and Jack story for another anthology that the International Association of Media Tie-In Writers is doing. It's their 3rd anthology following Double Trouble, which is also going to be alternate takes on Sherlock Holmes as well. Thank you very much for watching. Please, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. I'll be back next month with another reading, this one of my 2nd story for the Phenomenon Shared World Anthology series. Another story featuring Luminosity called This Little Light of Mine. And thank you very much for watching. Please stay safe, and I will see you next month.